Well, welcome back to the Millennial Harbinger YouTube channel. My name is Jordan Koss, your host. This is episode 8. And so the first 7 episodes was me reading through a paper I wrote back in 2020. Uh, and that paper was for a class for my doctorate of ministry degree at Fuller Theological Seminary. The class was Enchanting Faith with Dr. Richard Beck. And the paper I wrote was basically trying to understand and re-enchant a reading of Romans 1. In the verbiage of Charles Taylor, the idea of re-enchanting is to stop doubting and disbelieving in the supernatural world, particularly the supernatural world and worldview of, let's say, an ancient Israelite or ancient Hebrew person, as we see in the Old Testament. So using Dr. Michael Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview or divine counsel worldview as a means of re-enchanting our reading of Romans 1, and thus also our conversations in our churches about same-sex sexual behavior, same-sex sexual relationships, homosexual lifestyle in general. And that was a fun paper to write. And I learned a lot, but that study is ongoing. I'm kind of getting back to that now after finishing that paper at the end of 2020. I'm just now kind of getting back to approaching that subject again because I just so happened to, over the course of the past 2+ years, write and complete my final project for my DMin at Fuller. And so I'm now officially Dr. Koss. Thank you very much. Yes, appreciate that. That's a good feeling. But now I wanted to get back to this subject because this is such a huge subject today in our churches for Christians and just in general. I'm seeing a lot of Christians talking with a lot of young Christians that perhaps, let's say, are affirming and don't know all the information, that are very susceptible at buying into affirming arguments because they don't have a full understanding and view of what the New Testament, the Old Testament, how they approach the subject of sexual ethics, how Paul approaches the subject, how Moses in the Torah approaches the subject. And so I want to use this YouTube channel moving forward after the first 7 episodes to continue this conversation and look at what authors are writing about the subject today, like this one book we're going to talk about today with Rubel Shelly, Male and Female God Created Them, a biblical review of LGBTQ plus claims. And I just want to continue to use this YouTube channel as a means of for Christians, especially for lay Christians who don't have an academic background in studying the Bible. I want to use this channel as a means of helping others, ministers, or just any particular person who happens to come upon this channel. I appreciate what other channels are doing in relation to this topic and this subject, and I just want to kind of contribute my voice because it's been a very significant subject matter in my life as well. Okay, so here's what I want to do in this episode. Based upon what Rubel Shelly had to write and say in his book, I just want to kind of give you somewhat of a review and some observations based on what he had to say. So in his book, particularly in chapter 11 is titled The Pauline Text Part 1, Romans 1, 18 through 32. In my paper, I wrote it on Romans 1, 18 through 2:11 because based upon a discourse analysis that Dr. Lee wrote, that's the entire unit or discourse to look at. But he only talks about Romans 1, 18 through 32 here. But in chapter 11, he takes 2 chapters to talk about New Testament texts. Chapter 11 is Romans 1. Chapter 12 are 2 other texts. But starting out, I just want to make a few introductory remarks about this chapter, and then we'll go into some of my observations. So in chapter 11, which goes from page 257 to 79, he says this at the beginning: everything in the previous 10 chapters is vital to reading Romans 1, the apostle to the Gentiles, intelligently. So what did I do? I pat myself on the back. I read from the introduction all the way through chapter 11. I haven't read the rest of the book, but I've kind of thumbed through the entirety of it, especially those chapters I didn't read at the end of the book, but I've read introduction all the way through chapter 11. And so I did my due diligence in that regard before creating this video on reviewing it. Romans 1, also he says, 18 through 32, is one of 3 Pauline texts, again, that he discusses in chapters 11 and 12, that is central to the case that he's making in this book and, quote, critically important to the general understanding of Christian ethics. All right? So the reason why he talks about it is, it's central to his argument, it's central to his case, and critically important to understanding Christian sexual ethics in general, which everyone else says as well. It's a very important passage, Romans chapter 1. So the structure of the chapter goes like this. The part 1 of chapter 11 goes from 258 to pages 258 to 68. And part 1 is an exegesis on Romans 1, or what he calls the traditional view of the New Testament text, again, most central to his argument. Part 2 goes from page 268 through 77. And first off, it's a summary and response to the affirming argument of Gushy on Romans 1 from Gushy's book, Changing Our Mind. And I really, really appreciate Shelly doing that in this chapter. David P. Gushy is a prominent affirming voice today, arguing for the affirming stance that one can live in a same-sex sexual relationship and also be a faithful Christian. You can find plenty of videos of David P. Gushy's argument and him presenting on YouTube. But I appreciate Shelly doing that. One of the things that Shelly kind of relays to us is that Gushy really doesn't show his work. There's another YouTuber I've been following recently where he levels this criticism of a lot of affirming authors and thinkers, is that they really don't show their work in terms of how they got from point A to point B. How did you really understand this passage that take you from the traditional understanding of Judeo-Christian sexual ethics, which is a non-affirming understanding? How did you get from there to an affirming stance? Because you really have not shown your work. And that's what, at least that's what Shelly pretty much says of David P. Gushy. Just, in Gushy's own verbiage, he just kind of throws some sand up into the air to kind of like mess with our understanding of Romans 1, but it really doesn't give a coherent argument showing his work about how he actually reread Romans 1 to get to an affirming stance. So that's one thing that I really appreciate about Shelly doing, is kind of looking at Gushy's argument and changing our mind and kind of saying, hey, it's kind of really lacking here. Next, in part 2, he has this conversation about the Greek terms that we translate in Romans 1 as natural and unnatural. He has that discussion. I think that he has this discussion as in light of other affirming arguments and authors, such as like Karen Keene, that is Keen. Shelly responds to Karen Keene's book on this subject matter a lot throughout his own book. And I think he has this discussion as well in light of Keene and other affirming authors' arguments, which try to say, hey, this natural, unnatural verbiage has nothing to do with, basically it shouldn't lead us to a non-affirming understanding. And what Shelly says, though, which I'll get at a little bit later, is like, no, actually, we need to understand these terms the way Paul is intending them to mean in light of their overall Greco-Roman context as, natural meaning heterosexual, unnatural meaning homosexual relationships. But moving on. The end of chapter 11, at the end of part 2, he gives a response to the argument that, hey, the argument that Paul is making here in Romans 1 is kind of Paul doing this. Paul is like relaying to us an argument that really isn't his argument, but he's just relaying to us an argument that then he will go on and say, I don't agree with this. And Shelly kind of says, gives his argument why that's probably not the case either. Okay. So that's the structure of the chapter. Within the chapter itself are 7 framed quotes in the margins of the pages. 2 of those come from Carl Harper's book, Shame to Sin. Kyle Harper is a classicist, just like Shelley's background is as a classicist as well. Again, Rubel Shelly is his background is in Churches of Christ, as is my own. Rubel Shelly, as the bio on the back of the book says, was educated at Harding School of Theology, MA, MTH. I got my MDiv at Harding School of Theology. Then Shelley went on to Vanderbilt University, got his MA and PhD. His PhD is in the background. His specialty is in the classics, Greek and Latin writers back in the ancient world in the Greco-Roman context. So that is his specialty. That is his area of interest. Shelley is a prolific author. This is his latest book that he's written. And when I was at Rochester, what is now known as Rochester University in Rochester Hills, Michigan, he was the interim president there at the time, that 1 year I was up there back in the early 2000s. But Shelley's background, Rubel's area of expertise is what I was searching for, is in the classics. He is a classicist. He knows the ancient Latin and Greek writers' literature. And so probably one of the greatest contributions I think that he gives us in this book is approaching what Paul has to say, particularly in this chapter 11, Romans 1, from that perspective, the classicist perspective. Okay. And so he's a classicist like Kyle Harper here, and he quotes Kyle Harper all throughout the book and quotes him twice in these block quotes in chapter 11. He also quotes Christopher J.H. Wright from The Mission of God, Tom Holland from his book Dominion, again, a secular historian who himself, though, recognizes the New Testament writers are non-affirming in their understanding and what they have to say in the New Testament. So that's an interesting observation that Shelley gives us based upon Tom Holland's observation. He quotes from Kevin DeYoung from his book, What Does the Bible Really Teach Us About Homosexuality? He quotes Frank Thielman from his Romans commentary in the Zondervan exegetical series. And then finally, he quotes from Darren Belusek from his book, Marriage, Scripture, and the Church. But all in all, in the bibliography at the end of the chapter, there's a bibliography at the end of each chapter, Shelley quotes and refers to 25 separate authors in that chapter, in chapter 11. So pretty decent bibliography. Obviously, it's never complete, but he's got 25 authors he quotes from and references and cites. Okay, some observations here. Number one, like I mentioned before, Shelley's a classicist. If I'm pronouncing that correctly, if I'm even saying that correctly, he's not so much an exegete, right? So this chapter on Romans 1 is not his strongest, I would say, in the book in terms of exegesis of the passage. I was kind of left wanting in terms of the exegesis of the passage. But he does provide a good perspective from the angle of classical evidence to help read Romans 1, help read Paul well. And that's why he makes that observation at the beginning of the book, because he talks a lot about that classical evidence that we have from the Greek and Latin writers in Paul's day and Paul's context. It's like I wrote those previous chapters to help you understand this chapter on Romans 1 way better. So I appreciate Shelley's approach here in the book overall, and especially how his expertise gives us some insight into Romans chapter 1. For example, again, coming back to this natural versus unnatural discussion, he says that this discussion using these two terms is spoken of by philosophers and ethicists beginning no later than Plato, where sexual intercourse is described as a natural versus unnatural event. And his discussion there about these two terms takes place in pages 271 to 73. He goes on and says, physis is in its natural meaning is this, the way things are because they were created by God to be so. Okay. So again, one of the greatest strengths of the book is the classical evidence Shelley brings to the fore to argue against the common affirming stance that New Testament writers were only against abusive homosexual relations and not loving, consensual, committed same-sex relationships, marriages, because those didn't even exist back then. Okay, so not only does Shelley help us see, based upon his expertise in classical literature, help us read Romans 1 better, but because of his expertise in classical literature, he makes this overall argument throughout the book that, hey, look, this predominant affirming argument that says, hey, Paul couldn't possibly be arguing against same-sex, loving, consensual, committed same-sex sexual relationships, because they didn't even know that they didn't even exist back then. So because they didn't even exist back then, Paul couldn't be writing against them in Romans 1 and other places in the New Testament. Okay. Shelley, based upon his expertise and background in classical literature, says, no, not at all. That's ancient peoples, ancient writers were well aware of that such relationships, committed, same-sex, consensual, between two adults, same-sex sexual relationships did exist. And so that argument is fallacious. It's inaccurate. I'm going to read you a passage from his book in page 237, where he makes this argument. And again, there's many different places where he comes back to this throughout the book, at least the first 11 chapters that I've read. But this is just one place where he kind of hammers that point home again, based upon his expertise in classical literature, this affirming argument that these kind of relationships didn't exist back then. Therefore, there's no way Paul could have spoken against them. All right, so here we go, page 237. He says, in a word, revisionists argue that everything in the biblical material is a reaction against the negative social construct of exploitation. Pedophilia, pederasty, exploitation of slaves, cultic prostitution, battlefield rape. Yes, these are evil. They are evil. Yes, they should have been railed against and forbidden. But since they knew nothing of a positive form of sexual orientation that affirmed commitment, love, and nurture between same-sex partners, what the Bible condemns is not what we are witnessing now. That, at least, is the counterclaim to this book's thesis. Okay, so he just says that's what affirming authors, those who are affirming, want to say. The Bible's only against those exploitative relationships in the ancient world, not against positive, loving, committed, warm, consensual same-sex relationships. He goes on to say this, page 238. But is what we are witnessing in the 21st century really unique to modern times? Are we simply enlightened enough to practice a different form of same-sex engagement than ancient people fostered as their social construct? Or is this a weak argument that is rooted in a thinly veiled form of chronological snobbery that says ancient people could not have envisioned or framed same-sex relationships that were caring, warm, and other regarding? That is a rhetorical question, because then he says, yeah, he already has the answer, and he's given that answer throughout the book. This is just, again, one of multiple places where he gives that answer. It's like, look, we are kind of exhibiting that Enlightenment era chronological snobbery where we're smarter than ancients were, or we're more progressed than ancients were. And that idea of progression, of becoming progressively better, is not a very biblically accurate stance. But then perhaps affirming authors might not say, no, this isn't an aspect of chronological snobbery. This is just being contextually, sensitive. But again, Shelley's background in classical literature shows us that, yeah, it is perhaps kind of an example of chronological snobbery, or a bad argument that does not look at all the evidence that we can find in classical literature. He says enough historical evidence has been given already to show that it is a serious mistake for anyone to claim that ancient people had no concept of a natural orientation toward persons of the same sex. While folk and revisionists who continue to use orientation language to describe a modern social construct, ancient writers simply use their own vocabularies of time and place to describe the same phenomenon. Okay, so we use orientation, they used other language, but both people today and people 2,000 plus years ago were very much well aware of what we call today orientation. After referring to the speech of Pausanias that explains the inborn male, female, 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 and male, male sexual longings that drive persons to seek appropriate partners, no less an advocate of same-sex unions than Lewis Crompton makes this observation. We know that many Greeks had relations with both women and boys, but Pausanias clearly identifies another class of man, a class who are exclusively devoted to their own sex, approximating the modern conception of the, quote, homosexual. This idea of a homosexual, quote, orientation, though by no means central to Greek thinking as it is to ours, was certainly understood by Plato and his contemporaries. So I'll stop reading there, but man, that's again, I think this is like one of the greatest contributions that Shelley gives us in this book is that rebuttal to the affirming argument of they had no conception of loving, warm, consensual, same-sex sexual relationships back in the ancient world. Therefore, Paul could not possibly argue against that in passages like Romans 1. Shelley shows us like, look, it's simply ignoring the evidence that we do have. And it's also ignoring what these two terms mean, natural and unnatural. And again, he has that natural, unnatural discussion in light of such recent affirming authors like Karen Keene, who want to argue the opposite. Okay, that's the first observation. Another observation is based upon my angle of approaching Romans 1 in that paper I read from episodes 1 through 7 that I want to continue to try to keep unpacking here. And I read Shelley hoping that he might engage Heiser or that from that angle, but he didn't. No mention of Heiser's work or the Deuteronomy 32 worldview was found in Shelley's book. And again, one of the observations that Heiser makes of any Romans commentary or any commentary or book on perhaps like, Romans or any New Testament book that doesn't engage with the DCW, the Divine Council worldview, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, what he calls pretty much the ancient Hebrew Israelite conception of supernatural worldview, is therefore irrelevant. And so I wouldn't say that, Shelley's book is completely irrelevant. He doesn't engage with it because, again, that's not his specialty. Shelley's specialty is, again, classical literature. He's a classicist, and therefore, the fact that he doesn't try to engage with Heiser and that perspective, it's disappointing, but it's understandable. Heiser's work has been out for some time now. Like The Unseen Realm I think has been out since 2015. So I would hope that we would start seeing an engagement in discussions on sexual ethics with Heiser and other authors that engage Heiser and build off from what Heiser has written. Because again, last February, in February of 2023, Dr. Heiser passed away from cancer, unfortunately. So others are picking up his mantle and carrying forth his research. I hope to be one of those as well. But so Shelley quotes Kevin DeYoung, who discusses the exchange terminology on page 267. And Shelley himself also briefly discusses the term exchanged in pages 264 and 265. But neither of these authors discuss the term and idea in light of Heiser's Deuteronomy 32 worldview. I discussed the terminology such as exchange in Romans 1 in my paper, and which has a very Deuteronomy 32 worldview-y kind of background. Once you see the Old Testament passages that Paul is drawing from, that gives it its meaning here in Romans 1. And again, Shelley does not discuss the Old Testament text quoted and referenced by Paul within the passage itself, where we find the background to the exchange terminology, etc. This was, I think, a big miss, specifically and generally, with the lack of addressing Heiser's observations. So not only does he not discuss or engage with Heiser and similar literature, he also really doesn't go into any Old Testament text that Paul is actually quoting and referencing within the passage. So those were both two disappointments. But again, no exegesis can be totally comprehensive. And also, I want to say this, I just kind of criticized Shelley here, but Shelley's treatment of Romans 1 is better than how you're going to find many affirming authors engaging with Romans 1 themselves. Like, there's another YouTuber, I think I've already mentioned him here in this video, but I'm not going to mention him by name, but he says pretty much like Affirming authors don't show their work. They don't show how they get from A to B. Here, Shelley does a really good job engaging with the passage, trying to show us what Paul's intended meaning. And a lot of perhaps affirming authors might gloss over Romans 1 in a way in which you're kind of left wanting a wait, how did you get from A to B? How did you get from the traditional Judeo-Christian sexual ethic and non-affirming understanding of passages like Romans 1 all the way over to an affirming understanding of Romans 1? Like, help me out here. Show your work. I appreciate Shelley's engagement of this passage in light of the lack of engagement from other authors that you'll probably find if you dive into this subject and try to read a lot of the literature that's out there right now. Okay, so my third observation is this. Shelley quotes Richard Hayes a lot, several different times in chapter 11. And I think he quotes him a few more times throughout the book. Richard Hayes wrote The Moral Vision in the New Testament, and the quotes that he provides within the chapter, they're great quotes. But many people, such as the writer Jonathan Merritt, have mentioned that Hayes has become affirming since writing that book. But Hayes, since retiring, does not really want to put a target on his back by being public about it. In light of like what happened to other prominent and popular authors like Eugene Peterson and Jen Hatmaker. So I'm getting this from Jonathan Merritt's Twitter, now X page, in terms of him relaying Richard Hayes' change in stance from non-affirming to affirming. In A Moral Vision New Testament, Hayes is not affirming. And what Jonathan Merritt is saying is that Hayes is not now affirming, but he's just going to keep that to himself because he doesn't want what happened to Peterson and Hatmaker to happen to him in his retirement. Okay. And Hayes does go to Citywell Church in Durham, North Carolina, because Richard Hayes was a professor at Duke University. And Citywell Church, if you go online, you can see that they do have an affirming stance and statement for same-sex sexual relationships. So it's quite possible that Hayes is now affirming, and if so, that's unfortunate. But I guess Shelley using Hayes as a result of this development, I'm not really sure why he did it, because he should have been aware of that, and perhaps he was, but he still used Hayes's quotes from A Moral Vision in the New Testament. But so, I mean, that's a criticism. But what Shelley also does is he also devotes a lot of space to a quote from N.T. Wright in chapter 11. N.T. Wright, he pulled this quote from the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary on Romans that N.T. Wright wrote years ago. And N.T. Wright himself takes a non-affirming stance and a non-affirming understanding of what Paul had to say about same-sex sexual relationships in Romans 1. And if you don't know who N.T. Wright is, ooh, baby, you need to know who N.T. Wright is. N.T. Wright's got a ton of stuff on YouTube and online. Talk about a prolific author. N.T. Wright is crazy. He's written a crazy amount of books. He's the world's foremost theologian, New Testament theologian, especially on Paul. I came across N.T. Wright's material when I was an undergrad, especially when I was trying to write my MA thesis, when I was learning how to really write at that level and come into my own in terms of trying to be a theologian. So N.T. Wright's stuff is awesome. And to me, with that academic background, the fact that N.T. Wright is not affirming is a significant observation to take in. And like, whoa, if he's not affirming, I really need to take a step back and like reorient myself and think about this, especially if I am affirming at this time. But if you don't have that academic background, if you didn't study the Bible, college, seminary, and beyond in an academic setting and context, then I need to wake you up to the seriousness of that observation, that N.T. Wright is not affirming. And you need to dive into some writings by N.T. Wright to kind of see why. Why does N.T. Wright think that this way? And you really need to recognize the significance of that observation and the significance of N.T. Wright taking a non-affirming stance. All right. So those are my three observations. And my conclusion is basically this. All in all, I would totally recommend this book to anyone wanting to get a better understanding of this subject. I wouldn't have a problem utilizing this resource as a main text to teach a class on the subject, whether in an academic or church context. It wouldn't be the only one I would utilize. I would utilize others as well, but I would totally, I would have no problem utilizing it. I will also definitely use it as a reference whenever I talk about this subject in my own classes that I currently teach. Because again, I think what one of the things that Shelley does more than anything is give us a great perspective and angle based upon the classical literature evidence in terms of how to read the New Testament writers well and accurately, such as Paul in Romans chapter 1. So, guys, hey, thanks for sticking with me through this episode, talking about Shelley's latest book on the subject of same-sex sexual relationships, male and female, God created them. You should totally buy this on Amazon. It's not too expensive, and you will definitely not regret getting this book and making it part of your library at home if you're truly interested in becoming more aware of what the Bible actually has to say on this subject, a significant subject today in the church, outside the church, etc. So, guys, thanks for sticking with me again. Can't wait to continue this conversation in the next episode. And then until then, this is Jordan Koss signing off. We'll see you next time.